The first time King Jacob Lock's wolf saw his mate, she was telling a story to a pot of stew. It was well past midnight. Jacob was doing his final security sweep of the castle, a nightly ritual that had less to do with security and more to do with the fact that his wolf refused to sleep until every door had been checked, every corridor sniffed, every shadow personally interrogated. The wolf had opinions about perimeter integrity. Jacob had opinions about getting more than 4 hours of rest. The wolf was winning. He rounded the corner into the kitchen corridor and stopped dead. Jonah Wren, the pack's tail spinner, the woman who kept the Blackwood pack's entire oral history in her head like a living library, was standing over the massive hearth, stirring a pot of something that smelled like rosemary and poor life choices. She was also, apparently, performing for it.
"And so the great wolf Callum said unto his beloved,"
Jonah intoned, her wooden spoon raised like a scepter, her voice pitched to a dramatic baritone. "I have crossed the Whispering Falls and slain the shadow bear, and brought you its pelt as proof of my devotion." "And do you know what Merrin said?" She paused. The stew did not answer. She said, "Aldrich, that is a raccoon." She dissolved into her own laughter, a bright, unguarded sound that bounced off the stone walls. Then she began to sway, a loose, absent-minded movement, humming a tune that belonged to no song Jacob had ever heard. One hand still held the spoon. The other rested on her hip as she executed a slow, clumsy spin between the butcher's block and the hearth, still giggling at her own joke. Jacob's wolf, who had been cataloging exit routes with military precision 3 seconds ago, underwent a complete and catastrophic systems failure. "She is," the wolf began, and then stopped, which had never happened before in the entire recorded history of Jacob's consciousness. The wolf always had words, loud ones, in abundance. The silence lasted approximately 1.5 seconds, which was long enough for Jacob to experience genuine alarm. Then the wolf rebooted. "She is the most important thing that has ever happened, ever, in the history of happening. Look at the sway, look at the spin. She told the stew a story. The stew does not deserve her. We deserve her. We must learn the sway." Jacob, flattened against the doorframe like a man trying to become part of the architecture, watched Jonah execute another wobbly spin. She dipped the spoon into the pot, tasted it, made a face, and added more salt. Her dark hair was escaping its braid in approximately 40 directions. There was a smudge of ink on her jaw. She'd been writing again, transcribing the old stories into the leather-bound journals she kept in her quarters. She looked completely, devastatingly herself. "We must give her something," the wolf announced. "A gift. A tribute." "What about a rabbit? A freshly caught rabbit says I am a capable provider. And also, I noticed your sway, and it changed my entire molecular structure." "I am not giving the tail spinner a dead rabbit," Jacob muttered, and backed away before she could spot him. That night, sleep was a theoretical concept. Jacob lay in bed staring at the ceiling, while his wolf replayed the scene with the obsessive focus of a scholar analyzing a sacred text. The sway, the spin, the dip, the way her hips moved when she hummed, the way the firelight caught the ink stain on her jaw. The wolf cataloged every detail, filed it, cross-referenced it, and then replayed the entire sequence again from the beginning. "The sway is a language," the wolf declared at approximately 2 in the morning. "It communicates something profound about the nature of joy. We must become fluent." "We are not becoming fluent in swaying," Jacob said to his dark bedroom. "We are going to sleep." "We are not." Jacob woke on 4 paws. The shift had happened somewhere between the wolf's 14th viewing of the sway and Jacob's consciousness giving up and leaving the building. One moment he was a man in a bed. The next he was a very large black wolf, standing on the manicured lawn of the royal gardens, the cool night air ruffling his fur, the moon hanging fat and silver above the castle towers. His wolf had waited for the human to fall asleep and then simply taken the wheel. Not violently, not as a seizure of control, but in the way a person's body sometimes walks to the kitchen for water while their mind is somewhere else entirely. Jacob had wanted to sway. His wolf had agreed. His body had resolved the dispute. The great black wolf planted its paws on the grass. It assessed the terrain. It remembered the sway, left, then right, A gentle undulation, a rhythm without music. It began. The movement was, objectively, terrible. A 300-pound wolf does not sway. It is not engineered for lateral oscillation. What Jacob's wolf produced was less a dance and more the visual equivalent of a very large, very serious pendulum that had recently received devastating personal news. Left, pause. Right, pause. Left again, with a slight overcorrection that nearly toppled it onto the rose bushes. Its golden eyes were narrowed to slits of pure concentration. Its ears were pinned back with effort. This was not play. This was not silliness. This was a wolf in the grip of the most sincere and completely misguided courtship effort in the history of the species. Jonah found him because she couldn't sleep either. She'd been lying awake, her mind doing its usual late-night trick of rehearsing every story she'd ever told and identifying every place where she'd gotten a detail wrong, a name mispronounced, a date confused. The tale spinner's curse, a photographic memory for everyone else's mistakes, and an encyclopedic recall of her own. Her wolf, Silence, a creature of such composed analytical precision that it occasionally made Jonah feel like she was sharing a skull with an accountant, had offered its assessment of her insomnia. You are perseverating. This is unproductive. I recommend either sleep or a perimeter walk. The night air will recalibrate. So Jonah walked, and from the window overlooking the gardens, she saw a large, dark shape moving in the moonlight in a way that large, dark shapes should not move. Her first thought, intruder. Her second thought, upon recognizing the unmistakable bulk of the Alpha King in wolf form. What in the name of every story I have ever told is he doing? She crept outside, barefoot, her nightgown trailing in the damp grass. The closer she got, the clearer the picture became, and the less sense it made. The Alpha King of the Blackwood Pack, in his most formidable and terrifying form, the wolf that had once pinned a rival alpha to the ground with a single paw, the wolf whose howl could be heard 3 territories away, was swaying. Left, then right, with an expression of such solemn, unwavering dedication that he looked like he was performing a religious rite known only to himself. The alpha is oscillating, Silence observed from within her. The movement pattern is rhythmic but purposeless. Possible explanations: inner ear disturbance, neurological event, or... She trailed off, which was unusual for Silence. Actually, I have no explanation. This is unprecedented. Jonah watched from behind a rosebush for a full minute. The wolf swayed. It did not stop. It did not improve. At one point, it attempted what might have been a turn, a slow, laborious rotation that looked like a warship trying to execute a 3-point turn in a bathtub, and nearly sat on the hedge. The sound that escaped Jonah was not a laugh, it was a structural failure. A snort first, then a wheeze, then she was on the ground, her hand clamped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, her entire body shaking with the kind of silent, airless laughter that makes a person genuinely concerned about their own survival. She was going to die here, in the royal gardens at 2 a.m, murdered by the sight of a wolf trying to waltz. The great wolf's head snapped around, his ears shot up. He saw her. The great wolf's ears shot forward. Its tail, which had been hanging still and serious, gave a single enormous thump against the ground. The sway didn't stop. If anything, it intensified, a wider arc, a deeper commitment, the wolf equivalent of a man straightening his tie and squaring his shoulders. It swayed directly at her, its golden eyes blazing with a sincerity so absolute it could have powered a small city. Jonah managed to gasp enough air to form words. "Oh, you magnificent, ridiculous." Another wave of laughter took her out. She lay on her back in the wet grass, staring at the moon, wheezing. The most powerful wolf in the territory was standing over her, still swaying, his golden eyes filled with a sincerity so pure it was practically medicinal. The wolf sat. It looked at her. It thumped its tail once more, a deliberate, ceremonial thump, the kind that said, unmistakably, "Same time tomorrow." Then it stood, shook itself with immense dignity, and padded back toward the castle with the satisfied air of an artist who had just completed a masterwork. The next morning, in human form, the wolf would replay the entire scene with commentary. She witnessed the dance. She was overcome with emotion. This is clearly working. We shall perform it again tonight, and the next night, and every night until the heat death of the universe. It became their secret. Every night after the castle quieted and the guards settled into their posts, and the last candle was snuffed in the last corridor, Jonah would slip out to the gardens with a blanket and a cup of tea. Jacob's wolf would already be there, waiting. She would sit on the grass, tuck the blanket around her legs, and start humming, the aimless little tune she'd been swaying to in the kitchen that first night. And the great black wolf would dance. The sway never improved. It was architecturally impossible for it to improve. The fundamental engineering of a wolf's body was optimized for running, fighting, and looking dramatically into the middle distance, not for rhythmic lateral movement. But the wolf refused to accept this limitation. It treated the sway as a discipline, a practice, a calling. Every night it committed to the movement with the same gravity a monk might bring to prayer. Jonah provided encouragement. "That was a good one," she'd say, as the wolf completed a particularly committed lean to the left. "Really felt that one in my soul." The wolf would huff through its nose, a sound of dignified acknowledgement, and continue. Sometimes she told him stories while he swayed. The old ones, the founding myths of the Blackwood Pack, the tale of the first alpha who heard the howl of the moon and answered it, the love story of Brennan and Isla, who ran the length of the thornwood in a single night to reach each other. She told them differently here, in the dark, with an audience of one enormous swaying wolf. Looser, funnier, with the asides and commentary she never included in her official tellings. And Brennan, upon seeing Isla for the first time, was so overcome that he shifted right there in the middle of the harvest market, she narrated, sipping her tea. Which meant he was suddenly a very large, very naked man standing between a cheese stall and a woman selling turnips. The cheese seller fainted. Isla looked him over and said, "You'd better be worth the price of that cheese." The wolf paused its sway to look at her with an expression that clearly communicated, "This is the greatest story ever told." "That part's not in the official version," Jonah admitted. "Grandmother Thornton would have a stroke." The guards knew, of course. They were stationed on the battlements, at the palace doors, in the shadowed corridors. They saw their king swaying under the moon. They saw their tail spinner sitting on the lawn, narrating the pack's history to him like a bedtime story. They said absolutely nothing about it. Sergeant Gregor had once made the mistake of smiling during a shift change, and Jacob's wolf had stopped mid-sway to fix him with a look so withering that Gregor later reported to his wife that his blood had gone cold in a very specific and personal way. The unspoken rule of the Blackwood Pack became, whatever happens in the gardens at night is a hallucination we all share and never discuss. Jacob in human form was a different problem. As the wolf, everything was simple. See mate, sway for mate, receive mate's laughter like sunlight. As the man, Jacob was approximately as smooth as a gravel road. He had been king since he was 23, when his father had died in circumstances Jacob didn't discuss. He had spent the subsequent decade learning to lead through quiet authority, strategic patience, and an expression that suggested he was always thinking 3 moves ahead. This expression was, more often than not, a mask for the fact that he was thinking about Jonah. He stood in doorways a lot. He found reasons to walk past the Great Hall when she was practicing her stories. He developed a sudden and inexplicable interest in the castle's archive room, which happened to share a wall with her quarters. His wolf provided a constant, unhelpful narration. "She is in the next room. We can hear her turning pages. She turns pages with authority. This is incredibly attractive." "Please stop commenting on how she turns pages," Jacob said under his breath, pretending to read a tax ledger. She has just sighed. It was a small sigh, possibly wistful. What if she is thinking about the sway? What if she is composing a story about the sway? We would be in a story. This is the greatest honor imaginable. Marcus, Jacob's beta, watched all of this with the weary resignation of a man who had signed up to manage a pack and instead found himself managing a lovesick king. He had taken to carrying a book to council meetings, not for reading, but for placing on Jacob's bouncing knee when the wolf got restless. "You could just talk to her," Marcus said one morning, sliding a stack of border reports across the table. "Like a person, with words." "I talked to her," Jacob said, too quickly. "You said the weather is weather to her yesterday, in front of the entire kitchen staff." Jacob's jaw tightened. His wolf offered no defense. It was too busy replaying the way Jonah's eyebrows had risen, both of them in unison, a perfect expression of polite bewilderment when he delivered that masterpiece of conversation. The weather comment was a strategic opening, the wolf insisted. It established common ground. Everyone experiences weather. "I'll work on it," Jacob muttered. The problem arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a scroll. The Moonfire Bonfire, the Blackwood Pack's most important annual celebration, a night of fire and music and the retelling of the founding stories, was 4 weeks away. And according to every tradition the pack held sacred, the Alpha and his Luna were required to open the evening with a dance. Not a sway, a dance. A real one. Jacob read the scroll in his study and felt his stomach drop through approximately 6 floors of the castle. "We know a dance," his wolf said immediately. "We have been practicing. We are ready." "We know a sway," Jacob said. "A terrible sway. In wolf form. That is not the same as a formal dance in front of 600 people." "It is better. It is more authentic. The pack will weep with the beauty of it." The pack will weep, but not with beauty. Jonah received the same news and reacted the way Jonah reacted to most things that terrified her. She went very quiet, then very busy. Within an hour, she had retreated to her archive, surrounded by open journals and scattered pages, furiously transcribing a 300-year-old account of the Battle of Cairn Hollow that had absolutely no urgency and did not need to be transcribed at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. "You are avoiding," Silence noted. "I am preserving critical historical records." "You are hiding behind critical historical records because you have been asked to dance in public, and this has triggered a threat response disproportionate to the actual danger." "Thank you, Silence. That is incredibly helpful and not at all making it worse." The thing about Jonah's fear was that it wasn't really about dancing. It was about being seen. As the tale spinner, her job was to disappear, to become a vessel for the stories, to make the audience forget she existed and see only the wolves and the lovers and the heroes she conjured with her voice. She was brilliant at this. She could hold a hall of 300 wolves in absolute silence with nothing but her voice and a well-timed pause. She could make grown alphas cry with the story of Brennan and Isla. She could make pups howl with laughter at the tale of the wolf who ate the moon. But that was performance. That was craft. The moment the story ended, the moment she was just Jonah, a woman of medium height with ink-stained fingers and a tendency to talk too fast when nervous, and a complete inability to walk into a room without tripping on something, the magic evaporated. She wasn't the story. She was just the person who told it. And a Luna was supposed to be the story. The former Luna, Jacob's mother, who had died when he was a boy, was legendary. Jonah had grown up hearing the tales. Elena Locke had been a woman of terrifying grace, a dancer whose feet seemed to barely touch the ground, a Luna who could silence a brawl with a glance and charm a rival alpha with a smile. Jonah had told Elena's story dozens of times at pack gatherings. She knew every detail of the woman's elegance, her poise, her effortless command. And now she was supposed to fill those shoes, while tripping. Grandmother Thornton found her in the archive 3 days later. Grandmother Thornton was not actually anyone's grandmother. She was the pack's eldest female elder, a woman of 87 who had survived 3 alphas, 2 territory wars, and a legendary disagreement with a badger that had entered pack folklore. She wore her silver hair in a braid so tight It seemed to be holding her entire face in a state of permanent, mild disapproval. She was not unkind. She was simply from a generation that believed kindness and bluntness were the same thing. "You are the Luna now," Grandmother Thornton said, settling herself into the chair across from Jonah's desk with the slow deliberation of a woman who intended to stay until her point was made. "The Moonfire bonfire is in 3 weeks. You are expected to open the dancing." "Yes," Jonah said, her voice bright and hollow. "I'm aware." Elena Locke danced the opening reel with Alpha Thomas the year they took the Thornwood back from the Granite Jaw Pack. The entire gathering wept. It was transcendent. "I've told that story," Jonah said, "many times. Telling it and living it are different things, dear." Grandmother Thornton's voice was not cruel, it was factual, the way you might tell someone the weather was cold. "You have a lovely voice. Everyone says so. But a Luna's role at the Moonfire is not to narrate, it is to embody. I'm sure you'll find your way." She patted Jonah's hand, rose with the creak of ancient joints, and left. Jonah sat very still for a long time after that. "She is not wrong," Silence offered carefully. "The role does require physical presence. However, her delivery lacked tact. I would rate it a 3 out of 10 for emotional intelligence." "She's right, though," Jonah whispered. "I tell other people's stories. That's all I do. I stand at the fire and I make everyone else's life sound extraordinary. I don't have my own." "This is factually inaccurate," Silence countered. "You are the mate of an Alpha King. Your life contains numerous extraordinary elements, not least of which is the nightly spectacle of said Alpha King swaying in the garden like a metronome with emotional problems." Jonah laughed, but it was a thin, fragile thing. The imposter syndrome wasn't new. It had lived in her chest since the day the bond had snapped into place between her and Jacob. A warmth, a pull, a rightness so profound it terrified her. And she'd looked at this enormous, serious man with his crown and his responsibilities and his wolf that could shatter stone with a howl and thought, there has been a mistake. She started skipping the garden. The first night, she told herself she was tired. The second, that she had transcriptions to finish. By the third night, Jacob's wolf was pacing the garden alone, its tail low, its ears flat. It tried to sway, but the movement kept drifting into a restless circling, nose to the ground, then up, scenting the air for something that wasn't there. It lay down in the spot where she usually sat, pressed its muzzle into the grass where her scent still lingered, and whined. Once. Low and long and completely involuntary. In the morning, back in human form, the wolf's distress translated to a relentless loop. The mate is not here. The mate has abandoned the dance. Something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong. Jacob tried. He tried in his way, which was to stand near her and hope proximity would communicate what his words could not. He showed up at the archive with a cup of tea he'd made himself, badly, with too much honey, because his wolf had insisted honey was romantic, and Jacob's understanding of tea preparation was largely theoretical. "I brought you tea," he said, placing it on her desk with the care of a man diffusing a bomb. Jonah looked at the cup, then at him, then at the cup again. "Thank you. That's very sweet." She took a sip and managed not to wince at what was essentially warm honey with a memory of tea. Literally. "The mate has accepted our offering," the wolf crowed. "The courtship advances. Next we should bring her something larger, a deer, a small horse." "About the Moonfire," Jacob started. Jonah's entire body tightened. It was subtle, a shift in her shoulders, a stillness in her hands. But Jacob's wolf read it like a headline. Distress. She is distressed. Something about the fire night is causing pain. Identify and eliminate the source of pain. Is it the fire? We can fight the fire. "I'm fine," Jonah said, the two most unconvincing words in the history of language. "I've been practicing. I asked Marcus to teach me the opening reel. He's been very patient." "Marcus is teaching you to dance?" "He only stepped on my foot 4 times yesterday. We're improving." Jacob felt something twist in his chest. Not jealousy. Marcus was his brother in all but blood, and the idea of him as a romantic rival was as absurd as the wolf's sway. It was something worse, the realization that Jonah was trying to be something she wasn't, and she was doing it because she thought she had to, because she thought being herself wasn't enough. "You don't have to learn the real," he said quietly. "I'm the Luna, Jacob. The Luna opens the moonfire with a dance. Elena Locke was my mother, not my mate." The words came out rougher than he intended. His wolf, for once, was quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. "I didn't choose my mother, Jonah. I chose you." She looked at him, and for a second he saw it, the raw, terrified thing underneath all her competence and humor and the armor of other people's stories. Then it was gone, shuttered behind a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The tea is really lovely," she said. "Thank you." He left. He didn't know what else to do. The pack run was Jacob's idea, though he told himself it was routine. Every few weeks, the Blackwood pack ran together, a tradition older than the castle, older than the territory lines, older than memory. The entire pack shifted and ran the length of the thornwood under the moon. It was maintenance, communion, a collective exhale. Wolves who didn't run together stopped feeling like a pack. Jacob led from the front, as always. His wolf, massive, black, built like a small geological formation, set the pace. Around him the pack spread out through the trees, a river of fur and breath and pounding paws. Silver wolves, gray wolves, brown wolves, wolves with notched ears, and wolves barely old enough to keep up. They ran. His wolf should have been in its element. The run was everything it loved: speed, pack, the sharp, cold scent of pine and night air. But tonight, something was wrong. The rhythm was off. His stride kept hitching, his focus drifting. He'd surge ahead, then slow, then turn to look back toward the castle, ears pricked, nostrils flaring, searching for a scent that was miles away. Jonah rarely ran with the pack. She always said she'd slow everyone down, that her wolf was more of an indoor cat. It was a joke. It was also a wall. Beside him, Marcus's wolf, lean, gray, efficient, bumped his shoulder. A wordless check-in. "You okay?" Jacob's wolf huffed and ran harder. The trees blurred, the pack followed. But the howl he let out when they reached the ridge was thinner than usual, sharper, and every wolf in the pack heard it for what it was: a call with no answer. On the run back, they passed the eastern meadow, and Jacob's wolf slowed. 3 young wolves were tumbling over each other in the grass, play-fighting with the joyful gracelessness of youth. An older wolf, Nora, one of the pack's mothers, was sprawled nearby, watching them with the tolerant exhaustion of someone who had given up on dignity. One of the pups broke free and came bounding up to Jacob, skidding to a stop in front of the alpha's massive paws with the fearlessness of the very young. Jacob's wolf looked down at the pup. The pup looked up at Jacob's wolf. The pup's tail was a blur. The wolf lowered its enormous head and very gently bumped the pup's nose. The pup exploded with excitement, yipping and spinning in circles. Jacob's wolf watched it for a long moment, then turned its head back toward the castle. The longing in that look was so naked, so unguarded, that Marcus's wolf stopped running entirely. Later, back in human form, Jacob would understand what his wolf had felt in that meadow. Not a thought, a pull. The rightness of pack, the ease of belonging, and the ache of the one person who stood outside it, telling stories about a togetherness she didn't believe was hers. The shift back to human form came at the tree line, as it always did. Jacob surfaced from the wolf with the usual moment of disorientation, the world snapping from scent and instinct to language and thought, the cold air sudden on bare skin. Marcus had left clothes for him as always. Jacob dressed in silence, staring toward the castle, where one window, the archive, still glowed with candlelight. He found her where he always found her, but this time it wasn't the kitchen or the archive. It was the great hall, in the dead of night, alone. She was standing in the center of the vast, dark room, where the Moonfire Bonfire's opening dance would take place in 10 days. No fire in the hearth, no candles lit, just moonlight through the high windows, falling in silver columns across the stone floor. She was trying to dance. It was painful to watch, not because she was bad, she wasn't, not really, but because every movement was borrowed. She was mimicking. A step here that she'd watched the younger wolves practice, a turn there that she'd seen in the reel Marcus had tried to teach her. Nothing was hers. She was wearing someone else's movements like an ill-fitting coat, and the frustration radiated off her like heat. She stopped, pressed her palms to her eyes, stood there in the moonlight, very still, for a long time. "I don't know how to be this," she said to the empty room. Jacob stepped out of the shadows. "Jonah." She startled, then recovered with the dignity of someone who had been caught talking to Stu, dancing alone, and now crying in a ballroom, and had decided that embarrassment was simply a permanent state of being. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." "That's not reassuring." He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. "You're trying to learn the real." "I'm trying to not humiliate you in front of 600 wolves. There's a difference." "You couldn't humiliate me." "Jacob, I tripped over a flat floor yesterday, in front of Grandmother Thornton. She looked at me like I'd personally insulted gravity." A corner of his mouth twitched. "She made a joke about gravity," his wolf observed with reverence. "She is funny even when she is in pain. This is the most attractive quality in a mate. After the sway is first." "Sit down with me," Jacob said. "Why?" "Because I need to tell you something, and I can't do it while you're standing in the middle of a dance floor looking like you're about to fight it." They sat on the cold stone steps at the edge of the hall, side by side, close enough that Jonah could feel the warmth radiating off him. Wolves ran hot, and Jacob ran hotter than most, but not touching. The moonlight made everything silver and strange. "My father," Jacob said, and the word landed heavy, "was everything an alpha was supposed to be. Strong, decisive, certain. He never hesitated. He never questioned himself. He walked into every room like he already owned it, and every fight like he'd already won it." Jonah was quiet. She knew this story. She was the tale spinner. She knew every story, but she'd never heard Jacob tell it. The official version was a hero's death. The real version, she suspected, was something else. "There was a fissure in the northern ridge," Jacob continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "Our scouts reported unusual movement from the Granite Jaw pack. One of the elders, a young man then with more ambition than sense, presented a full tactical analysis showing that the Granite Jaws were going to come through the ridge. He recommended pulling back, reinforcing, waiting. What did your father do? Called him a coward. Said maps were the coward's art. Said a real alpha trusted his gut." Jacob's hands were clasped between his knees, his knuckles white. "He led 30 wolves through the ridge to show strength. The Granite Jaws were waiting. They all died. Every one of them, my father included. The silence was enormous. I was 23, Jacob said. I became alpha on the same day I buried my father. And I have spent every single day since then terrified that I am him. That underneath every careful decision, every strategic pause, every moment of patience, I am just a man who is too certain and too blind, and who will get his people killed because he doesn't know how to doubt himself." He turned to look at her. In the moonlight, his golden eyes were raw, stripped of every layer of kingly composure. "That's why I freeze around you, Jonah. Not because I don't know what to say, because you're the only person who makes me feel like I don't have to perform. And that terrifies me, because the last alpha who stopped performing got people killed." Jonah's breath caught. Her wolf was utterly still, a silence not of analysis, but of recognition. "I don't know how to dance," Jacob said. "I don't know how to be charming or graceful, or any of the things a king is supposed to be in public. I know how to make decisions that keep people alive, and how to sway badly in a garden at 2 a.m. That's it. That's my entire range." She stared at him, this enormous, powerful, terrifying man who had just told her that his greatest fear was the same as hers, not being enough. Jacob, she said, her voice cracking. I tell stories about great wolves and legendary mates for a living. I stand at the fire and I make other people's love sound transcendent. And then I go back to my room and I can't. I don't know how to be inside my own story. I know every word of how Elena Locke danced at the Moonfire. I've told it 100 times. I've made people weep with it. And I can't do it. I can't be her. I'm just the woman who tells the story, not the woman in it. Her voice broke on the last word, and the tears she'd been holding for weeks finally spilled over. I'm not a Luna, Jacob. I'm a narrator. I stand outside the story and make it beautiful for everyone else. That's my gift. That's all I am. Jacob reached out. His hand, rough, warm, slightly trembling, cupped her face. His thumb traced the track of a tear across her cheek, catching it at the curve of her jaw where the ink stain always lived. You are the story, he said. You are every story. You are the reason the pack remembers who they are. You think you stand outside? Jonah, you are the thread that holds every one of us together. Without your voice, we are just wolves in a dark wood. You give us our past, our meaning, our... He stopped, struggling for the word. The word is everything, his wolf supplied, its voice for once barely above a whisper. The word is everything. She is everything. You give us ourselves, Jacob finished. And you think that's not enough to be a Luna? She broke. The sob that came out of her was ugly and real, not the kind you see in stories, and Jacob pulled her against his chest and held her there. She cried into his shirt, her fists balled in the fabric, and he held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had never stopped shaking under his feet. His wolf was silent. Perfectly, respectfully silent. For the first time in Jacob's life, the loudest thing in his head had nothing to say. It just settled, warm and present, a deep hum of mate, mine, enough. 10 days passed. They didn't talk about the dance. They didn't practice the reel. They didn't plan. What they did, quietly and without discussion, was return to the garden. The sway resumed. Every night, the great black wolf and the woman with the ink-stained fingers. But something had shifted. Jonah didn't just sit and watch anymore. She sat and told stories, but now she told them differently. She told the ones that had never been told, her own stories. The first time I told a story to the whole pack, she said one night, her tea steaming in the cool air, her back against the oak tree. I was 11. It was the midsummer gathering. I was supposed to tell the story of the first hunt. I got up in front of 400 wolves and opened my mouth, and absolutely nothing came out. The wolf paused its sway, one ear cocked toward her. I stood there for what felt like an hour. It was probably 10 seconds. And then my mother, who was sitting in the front row, said very loudly, "Jonah, if you're going to stand there with your mouth open, at least catch some flies and make yourself useful." The wolf huffed, a laugh. Everyone laughed, and the laughing broke the fear. I started the story, and I've never stopped. She paused. But I've never stopped being afraid either. Every time I stand up, for a second, I'm 11 again, mouth open, nothing coming out. She looked at the wolf, at his great golden eyes watching her with an attention so focused it was almost physical. That's not in any of the stories I tell. The tail spinner is supposed to be invisible. You don't hear about her stage fright. You hear about the wolves. The wolf swayed, left, then right, slowly, like a heartbeat made visible. You know what your problem is? Jonah said, a smile creeping back. You've never cared about being invisible. You sway like the entire world is watching, and you want them to see. We do, the wolf agreed. We have nothing to hide. The sway is honest. The sway is truth. The sway is... Still terrible, Jonah finished, and the wolf's tail thumped once hard against the ground. Affirmative. The night of the Moonfire bonfire arrived like a held breath. The great hall was transformed. 3 massive bonfires roared in the stone-lined pits, sending columns of flame and sparks toward the vaulted ceiling. Every surface was draped in garlands of thornflower and juniper. The scent was overwhelming, wood smoke and pine resin, and the collective warmth of 600 wolves packed into one ancient hall. Torches lined the walls. The fiddlers were tuning. The drums were waiting. Jonah stood backstage, if you could call the corridor behind the Great Hall's main entrance a backstage, and contemplated the merits of simply running away and living in the woods forever. She was dressed in the traditional Luna's gown, a deep green dress that someone with more confidence would have looked stunning in. On Jonah, it fit like a costume she'd borrowed from a better cast production of her own life. "You look fine," Silence offered. "The dress is well constructed. Your heart rate, however, suggests you are being pursued by a predator. This is inaccurate." "My heart rate is appropriate to the situation. The situation is a party. The situation is 600 wolves watching me prove I'm not worthy of..." "Incorrect framing. You are applying a narrative structure to a social event. This is a professional hazard of your occupation." Jonah let out a laugh that was 90% panic. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. Jacob found her there. He was dressed formally, which meant he looked like a man who had been stuffed into nice clothes against his will and was enduring it with the same stoic resolve he brought to border disputes. His hair had been combed, which just made it look like it was planning its escape. "You look," he started. "She looks like moonlight and stories and the reason we exist," the wolf supplied. "Really good," Jacob finished, and immediately wanted to walk into the nearest bonfire. "Really good? We had moonlight and stories and the reason we exist, and you went with really good? This is a catastrophic failure of communication. We demand a do-over." Jonah managed a shaky smile. "You look really good too. Very combed." They stood there, two people who were about to walk into a room full of 600 wolves and do something neither of them knew how to do. The silence was thick with shared terror. "Jacob," Jonah said, "I can't do the reel." "I know. I've been practicing for 3 weeks and I still can't do the reel. Marcus is a saint, but even saints have limits, and I think I found his when I accidentally kneed him in the..." "Jonah. Anyway, the point is, I am going to walk out there and I am going to destroy the opening ceremony of the most important night in the Blackwood Pack's calendar. And Grandmother Thornton will be right, and Elena Locke will be rolling in her grave, and..." "Jonah." She stopped, looked at him. His golden eyes were calm, steady, and absolutely certain. "Do you trust me?" he asked. "With my life," she said, without hesitation. "Then follow my lead." The great doors opened. 600 wolves turned to watch their Alpha and their Luna enter the hall. The drums began, a slow, ceremonial rhythm that had opened every moonfire since the founding of the pack. The bonfires crackled. The hall was silent, except for the beat. Jacob led Jonah to the center of the floor. Her hand was in his, and she was gripping it with a force that suggested she was either deeply in love or trying to break his fingers. Both, possibly. They reached the center, faced each other. The fiddler raised the bow, waiting for the Alpha's nod to begin the reel. Jacob did not nod. Instead, he placed one hand on Jonah's waist, the other held hers, and he began to sway, left, then right. A slow, deeply serious, side-to-side movement that had no connection to the waiting music, to the expectations of 600 wolves, to anything resembling a traditional ceremonial dance. It was the garden sway, their sway, the worst dance in the world, performed on the biggest stage imaginable. A murmur rippled through the hall. Grandmother Thornton's eyebrows achieved an altitude previously thought impossible. Marcus dropped his head into his hands. The fiddler lowered the bow, confused. Jonah stared up at Jacob, her mouth open. He was looking down at her with an expression of such tender, stubborn, absolute sincerity that it bypassed every defense she had. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Dancing," he said, "the only dance I know." "This is the moonfire, in front of the entire pack. You can't just..." I can. I'm the king. It's one of the few perks. A laugh escaped her, not a polished, performance-ready laugh, but the real one, the snorting, helpless one from the garden. She pressed her forehead against his chest to hide it, her shoulders shaking. He swayed. She swayed with him. Two people, impossibly out of sync with the world, locked perfectly in sync with each other. His wolf was incandescent. The great dance on the great stage. We are performing the great dance, and the mate is laughing, and the whole pack is watching, and this is the single greatest moment in the entire history of wolf civilization. I want this carved in stone. I want songs written. I want... And then Jonah did something unexpected. She stepped back. Not away, just far enough to look at him, and then to look at the crowd. 600 wolves, watching, confused, some smiling, some bewildered, all waiting. The tailspinner saw her audience, and the tailspinner began to speak. Once, Jonah said, her voice carrying through the hall with the effortless projection of a woman who had been filling rooms with stories since she was 11 years old, there was a wolf who couldn't dance. The hall went quiet. Not the confused silence of moments before, the deep, attentive silence she commanded every time she opened a story. Even the bonfires seemed to soften their crackle. He was the biggest wolf in the territory, she continued, still swaying gently with Jacob, her hand still in his. The strongest, the most feared. His howl could be heard 3 territories away, and he could not dance. She looked up at Jacob, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. He looked back at her, and she could see the moment he understood what she was doing. One night, this wolf saw a woman, a foolish woman, who talked to stew and tripped on flat surfaces and believed she was nobody's idea of extraordinary. He saw her sway, and his wolf, who had never in his entire life been at a loss for words, went completely and utterly silent. A low ripple of laughter moved through the hall. Jacob's ears turned red. So the wolf did what wolves do, Jonah said. He tried to learn. He went to the garden in the dead of night and he practiced, and it was... She paused, and the pause was perfect, the timing of a master storyteller. It was the worst thing anyone has ever seen. The laughter was louder now, genuine, the kind of laughter that comes from recognition, from delight. The woman found him there. She laughed so hard she fell over. And then she came back the next night, and the next, and every night after that. Because the thing about this terrible, terrible dance was that it was honest. It wasn't trying to be beautiful. It wasn't performing. It was just a wolf, swaying in the moonlight, saying the only thing he knew how to say. I am here. I see you. You are worth this ridiculous, undignified, magnificent effort. Jonah's voice softened. The hall was utterly still. And the woman, the one who told everyone else's stories because she didn't think she had one of her own, realized she'd been wrong. She was in a story. The best story she'd ever told. She just hadn't recognized it because it didn't look like the ones she knew. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't grand. It was 2 people, swaying badly, in the dark, too afraid of not being enough to realize they were already everything. She looked at Jacob. His golden eyes were bright with something she'd never seen there before. Not the guarded intensity of the king, not the awkward stiffness of the man who said the weather is weather. Something open, something released. So, Jonah said, turning back to the pack, her voice rising with a warmth that filled every corner of the ancient hall. If you came here tonight expecting a graceful opening dance from your Alpha and your Luna, she grinned. I'm sorry, you're getting the sway. She took Jacob's hand. He pulled her close. They swayed. And a sound rose from the hall, not a polite smattering of applause, but a roar. A genuine, joyful, foot-stomping, table-pounding roar of 600 wolves who had just been given the most unexpected, most honest, most deeply silly gift their Alpha and Luna could have offered. Grandmother Thornton, from her seat of honor, watched the spectacle with an expression that moved incrementally from disapproval to bewilderment to something that, if you were feeling generous, you might have called the early stages of a smile. Her wolf, ancient and dignified, observed, "This is irregular," and then, after a pause, "but effective." The fiddler, ever adaptable, began to play. Not the reel, but a slow, simple melody that matched the rhythm of the sway. The drums picked up a gentle swaying beat, and then, one by one, the pack rose. Marcus was first, because Marcus was always first when it mattered. He stood, walked to the dance floor, and began to sway. Badly, generously, with the wholehearted commitment of a man who loved his alpha like a brother. Nora joined him. Then Sergeant Gregor, whose sway was so wooden it looked like physical therapy. Then a pair of young wolves who had been giggling in the corner. Then entire tables. Then the whole hall. 600 wolves swaying. Left, then right. Out of time with the music, out of step with each other, completely, joyfully together. Jacob looked down at Jonah, who was crying and laughing at the same time, her face pressed against his chest, her tears making a small, dark patch on his shirt. "You told our story," he said, his voice rough. "It's a good story," she said. "Someone had to tell it." "You're a terrible dancer." She tilted her head back, grinning through her tears. "I learned from the best. My wolf learned from watching you through a kitchen doorway." His arms tightened around her, and his voice dropped to something only she could hear, low, certain. The voice of a man who had spent 10 years being afraid and had just, in this moment, stopped. And he's never going to stop. They swayed. The pack swayed with them. Grandmother Thornton, who had not swayed since 1974, was observed by multiple witnesses to move her left shoulder approximately 1 inch to the right before catching herself and pretending it hadn't happened. A new tradition was born that night, not with grace, not with grandeur, with a terrible dance, an honest story, and 600 wolves who chose, together, to look ridiculous in the firelight. Months later, the Moonfire Sway, as it came to be called, was the story every pup in the Blackwood pack asked to hear at bedtime. Jonah told it differently every time. Sometimes it was a comedy, with Jacob's wolf's inner monologue expanded to such absurd proportions that the pups howled with laughter. Sometimes it was a love story, soft and warm, that made the older wolves go quiet. Sometimes, when the night was cold and the fire was low, she told the true version, the one about two people who were afraid of not being enough, who found each other in a dark garden, and who discovered that the worst dance in the world was the most honest thing either of them had ever done. Jacob still swayed, every night in the garden on 4 enormous paws. Jonah still watched, still hummed, still told him stories while he rocked gently under the moon. The difference was that now, sometimes, she'd shift too. A smaller wolf, brown and bright-eyed, her wolf's composure translating to a stillness that was less analytical and more at peace. And she'd sit beside him, not swaying, just there. Silence and the wolf with no name, side by side, breathing. One night, Jacob's wolf nudged Jonah's wolf with its nose, gently, insistently, and then began to sway. It looked at her. It swayed again. It looked at her again. The message was unmistakable. Your turn. Silence regarded the display with her usual analytical composure. He wants me to oscillate. The biomechanical limitations are obvious. His technique has not improved. Learning from him would propagate the same fundamental errors. She paused. Then she stood, planted her paws, and swayed, once, a single precise lateral movement, executed with such clinical perfection that it made Jacob's wolf look even worse by comparison. Jacob's wolf was delighted. It thumped its tail so hard the ground shook. Back in human form the next morning, the wolf was still celebrating. She did the sway. Silence did the sway. The errors have been transmitted. They are features now. The dynasty of terrible dancing expands. The day Jonah told Jacob she was pregnant, he was in a council meeting about grain storage. She hadn't planned it this way. She'd planned candles and maybe a walk in the garden, and a carefully worded speech she'd been rehearsing in the archive for 2 days. What actually happened was that she walked into the council chamber, saw Jacob looking at her with that particular expression he wore when he'd been away from her for more than 3 hours, part relief, part wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was still there. And the carefully worded speech evaporated. "I'm pregnant," she said, to the entire council. Marcus dropped his quill. Grandmother Thornton's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Sergeant Gregor, who was standing guard by the door, made a sound like a balloon losing air very slowly. Jacob stared at her. His wolf, for the second time in recorded history, went completely silent. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then, a pup. A pup. We have made a pup. The mate has grown a pup inside her using the miracle of biology, and we are responsible. And this is the greatest achievement in the history of wolves, and also the history of pups, and also the history of everything. We must sway. We must sway immediately. This calls for the most significant sway ever performed." Jacob stood up from the council table, crossed the room in 3 strides, lifted Jonah off her feet, journal, ink-stained fingers and all, and kissed her with such thorough, unhurried tenderness that Marcus had to look away, and Grandmother Thornton had to take a very deliberate sip of tea to compose herself. "The grain storage discussion," one of the junior council members ventured, "is adjourned," Marcus said, already steering the remaining council members toward the door. "Permanently. Forever. Everyone out." The months that followed were, by Jonah's account, the most absurd of her life, and the competition for that title was fierce. Jacob's wolf entered a state of protective hypervigilance so extreme that it bordered on performance art. Every creak of the castle was a potential threat. Every draft was a conspiracy against the pup's comfort. When Jonah sneezed once, Jacob materialized in the doorway of her archive so fast she was fairly certain he had broken several laws of physics. "I'm fine," she said. "It was a sneeze. Dust. From a book. From the 14th century. The book attacked the mate. The book is a threat. We should destroy the book." "We are not destroying a 400-year-old manuscript because it made me sneeze." "We could destroy it a little." Silence, who had been running a calm biological assessment in the background for the entire pregnancy, offered her perspective. The sneeze was histamine-related and presented 0 risk to the developing pup. The alpha's response, however, is elevating the Luna's cortisol, which is counterproductive. Recommend the alpha return to a distance of no less than 15 feet. Jacob did not return to a distance of 15 feet. Jacob sat down on the floor of the archive, leaned his back against the bookshelf, and stayed there. Jonah looked at this enormous, serious man sitting on her floor like a guard dog who had been told to stay and had interpreted the command as a sacred oath. "You're going to sit there until I'm done working, aren't you?" "Yes." "That could be hours." "Yes," she sighed. But she was smiling, and when she reached down to run her fingers through his hair, an absent-minded gesture that had become habit, the way you might pet a very large, very devoted animal, his eyes closed and his wolf made a sound so deep and contented that it vibrated through the floorboards. "Stay," the wolf hummed. "Just stay." The pup arrived on a night when the moon was full and the garden was silver with frost. They named her Rowan. She was small and red-faced and furious about the entire concept of existing, and she announced her arrival with a cry so loud that Sergeant Gregor, 2 floors down, snapped to attention and nearly drew his weapon. Jacob held her for the first time with hands that had snapped bones and commanded armies, and those hands trembled. His wolf, the loudest thing in any room, in any skull, in any kingdom, looked at the tiny creature in their arms and whispered, "Oh." Just that, nothing else. The smallest sound the wolf had ever made, for the biggest thing it had ever felt. Jonah, exhausted and radiant, watched her enormous, terrifying mate hold their daughter like she was made of glass and starlight and the last good thing in the world.
You can breathe, she said softly. She's not going to break.
I know, Jacob said, not breathing. She is structurally sound, Silence reported. All vital signs are within normal parameters. She has your lung capacity, Jonah. This will be audible. Rowan proved Silence right within the hour. The pup had inherited her mother's lungs and her father's stubbornness, and she used both with tremendous enthusiasm. She cried when she was hungry, cried when she was tired, cried when the room was too bright, too dark, too warm, too cold, or too quiet. She cried on one memorable occasion because a shadow moved on the wall in a way she found personally offensive. Jacob's wolf responded to every cry with the same escalating urgency. The pup is distressed. Identify the threat. Is it the shadow? We will fight the shadow. Is it the temperature? We will negotiate with the temperature. You cannot fight a shadow, Jonah said at 3 a.m, Rowan screaming in her arms, both of them cross-eyed with exhaustion. We can try. But it was the sway that saved them. Rowan was 3 weeks old and had not, as far as either parent could tell, slept for more than 40 consecutive minutes since birth. They had tried everything. Rocking, singing. Marcus, in a moment of desperation, had offered to read her the Border Patrol reports, on the theory that they put everyone else to sleep. Nothing worked. It was 2 a.m. Jonah was pacing the nursery, Rowan howling against her shoulder. Jacob was standing in the doorway, helpless, his wolf cycling through increasingly unhinged suggestions. Have we tried howling back? Maybe she wants a howl, a solidarity howl, a "we are also upset and we understand" howl. If you howl, Jonah said, her voice flat with exhaustion, I will put you outside. And then, because her body remembered what her brain had forgotten, she began to sway, left, then right. The same aimless, gentle, side-to-side movement she'd been doing the night Jacob's wolf first saw her. Not a performance, not a technique, just her body moving the way it moved when she wasn't thinking, when she was stirring a pot, or humming a tune, or standing at the fire, lost in a story. Rowan's crying hitched, stuttered, faded to a whimper, then a sigh, then nothing. The sudden silence was so profound that Jonah was briefly afraid something had gone wrong. She looked down. Rowan was asleep. Truly, deeply, miraculously asleep. Her tiny fist curled against Jonah's collarbone, her breathing slow and even. Jonah looked at Jacob. Jacob looked at Jonah. Don't stop, he whispered, as though she were diffusing a bomb. She didn't stop. She swayed, barely breathing, for 20 minutes until she was certain the sleep had taken hold. Then she lowered Rowan into the crib with the exquisite care of a woman handling nitroglycerin, backed away 1 centimeter at a time, and collapsed into Jacob's arms. The sway, she breathed. It was the sway. His wolf was beside itself. The sway, the sacred sway. It has powers. We always knew it had powers. It is not just a dance. It is a force of nature. It cures all ailments. It conquers all foes. It defeats infant insomnia, which is the most dangerous foe of all. From that night on, the sway was no longer just theirs. It was the family's. Jacob would come home from council meetings to find Jonah swaying slowly around the nursery, Rowan drowsy against her chest, humming the little tune that had started everything. He'd step in behind her, wrap his arms around them both, and sway with them. 3 bodies, 1 rhythm, the worst dance in the world, and the only lullaby that worked. Rowan's first shift came early, far earlier than anyone expected. She was 8 months old, sitting on a blanket in the garden while Jonah told her a story. It was a warm evening, the kind where the light turned everything gold, and Jacob was sitting nearby, pretending to read reports, but actually watching his daughter try to eat her own foot. The pup is attempting to consume her extremity, Silence noted. This is developmentally normal, but nutritionally pointless. Jonah was midway through a simplified version of Brennan and Isla, and Brennan said, I will cross the big forest to find you, and Isla said, you'd better bring snacks, when Rowan sneezed and shifted. One moment, a baby. The next, a very small, very confused, russet-colored wolf pup sitting in a pile of tiny clothes, blinking at the world with enormous golden eyes. The silence lasted approximately 1 second. "A pup!" Jacob's wolf screamed, so loud inside his skull that Jacob physically flinched. "A wolf pup! Our pup is a wolf! Our pup shifted! She is the most magnificent wolf in the history of wolves! She is perfect! She is already better at being a wolf than most adult wolves! Look at her ears! Her ears are flawless." The tiny wolf pup sat in the grass and sneezed again, which did not trigger a shift back, but did cause her to topple sideways with a small, indignant yip. "She has shifted," Silence confirmed, with what Jonah could have sworn was a note of warmth. "Early onset. Strong wolf. She has your eyes, Jacob." Jacob was already on his knees in the grass, his hands hovering, afraid to touch, afraid to not touch. The tiny pup looked up at him, wobbled to her feet, and took 3 determined, wildly unsteady steps toward his hand. Then she sat on it. "Hi," Jacob said, his voice breaking on the single syllable. Jonah watched them, her impossible, wonderful mate, kneeling in the grass with tears on his face, a wolf pup the size of a loaf of bread sitting on his hand like a queen on a throne, and her own eyes blurred. She pressed her hand to her mouth. The tail spinner, for once, had no words. Jacob shifted. The great black wolf materialized in the garden, and the pup, who had been confused about many things in her short life but was absolutely certain about this, yipped with delight and scrambled toward her father on legs that didn't entirely work yet. The great wolf looked down at his daughter. The daughter looked up at her father, and the great wolf began to sway, left, then right, the same terrible, wonderful, deeply sincere movement. The pup watched, her head tilting so far to one side that she nearly fell over. Then she tried. What emerged was not a sway. It was not a dance. It was not, by any generous interpretation, a coordinated movement of any kind. It was a tiny wolf pup rocking sideways with such chaotic enthusiasm that she repeatedly tipped over, scrambled up, and immediately tipped over again, her little tail wagging so hard it threw off her already non-existent balance. The great wolf watched the pup faceplant for the 4th time. Its tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster, then with a force that sent leaves skittering across the grass. It lowered its enormous head and bumped the pup gently back onto her feet. She toppled again immediately. The tail wagged harder. The wolf's entire body was vibrating with something that, on a human face, would have been the purest, most deranged pride imaginable. Jonah was crying. She was laughing. She was doing both so hard she couldn't tell which was which anymore. She sat in the grass and watched her family, the king who couldn't dance and the pup who couldn't stand, sway together in the golden evening light, and she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than words, deeper than stories, deeper than any tale she'd ever told, that this was the one. This was the story she'd been waiting her whole life to live. Later, back in human form, Jacob's wolf would not stop. "She is a natural, a prodigy. Did you see the commitment, the follow-through?" She fell 4 times and did not quit. The sway is in her blood. The Locke legacy continues. Rowan sneezed, shifted back into a very naked, very startled baby, and burst into tears. Jacob shifted back, scooped her up, wrapped her in his shirt, and held her against his chest. She quieted almost immediately, her tiny hand gripping the fabric over his heart. He began to sway, left, then right. Jonah stood, walked over, and tucked herself under his arm, pressing her cheek against his shoulder. The 3 of them swayed together in the garden as the sun went down and the first stars appeared. "I need to write this one down," Jonah murmured. "Write all of it," Jacob said. So she did. The next evening, Jonah stood before the packfire for the weekly telling, Rowan asleep in a sling against her chest, and she opened the way she always opened, with a voice that could hold a room, a pause that could stop time, and a story that was, for the first time, entirely her own.
Once, she said, there was a wolf who couldn't dance.
And 600 wolves leaned in to listen. She told them everything: the stew, the kitchen doorway, the great black wolf swaying under the moon like a metronome with feelings, the woman who thought she was nobody's story, the night in the dark hall when two people cracked open and found the same fear underneath, the bonfire, the sway, the pup who tried to sway and fell over 4 times and didn't stop trying. She told it with the humor of a woman who found the whole situation ridiculous. She told it with the tenderness of a woman who was completely, irreversibly in love. She told it the way she told everything, like it was the most important story in the world, because right now, in this moment, with this audience, it was. When she finished, the hall was quiet. Then Grandmother Thornton, from her seat of honor, raised her cup. "To the sway," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. Just a little. Just enough. "To the sway," 600 wolves echoed. Jacob, standing at the back of the hall with Rowan drowsy against his shoulder, swayed. Just barely. Just enough for Jonah to see. She met his eyes across the firelit room, and the smile she gave him was the kind that belongs in stories. The kind she'd described 1,000 times for other people. The kind she'd never believed would be hers. It was hers. It was theirs. It was more than enough.